The Corvathian Survival Academy had spent the last 3 centuries perfecting the art of making species from across the galaxy suffer in highly controlled, extremely expensive ways. Nestled on a space station that orbited nothing in particular, the Academy prided itself on washing out approximately 92% of applicants before they even reached the actual examination phase. The remaining 8% were considered either brave, foolish, or possessed of a death wish so profound that even the Nitherian grief counselors refused to treat them. The Academy's brochures, printed on actual physical paper because apparently suffering should start with paper cuts, promised that graduates would possess skills to survive anywhere in the known universe. What the brochures failed to mention was that most participants wouldn't survive the process of learning those skills. This particular cycle had attracted candidates from 214 different worlds, each one convinced that their species' unique evolutionary advantages would carry them through. The Corvathians, who resembled bipedal lizards with an inexplicable fondness for bureaucracy, had reviewed every application with the kind of sadistic glee usually reserved for tax auditors and parking enforcement officers. They had approved exactly 100 participants, a number they considered symbolically perfect and practically hilarious given the survival rate projections. The exam protocols changed annually because the Corvathians believed in keeping things fresh and also in preventing anyone from actually preparing adequately. Previous years had featured delightful challenges such as underwater basket weaving in acid oceans, constructing shelters from carnivorous plants, and a memorable year where participants had to survive on a planet where the local cuisine was sentient and held grudges. This year, however, the examination committee had outdone themselves. They had chosen planet Threnix 9, a world so inhospitable that even the bacteria had evolved defense mechanisms, and implemented a rule that sent waves of excitement through the instructor lounge. No combustion allowed, no fire, no plasma torches, no thermal generators that relied on chemical reactions, nothing that produced flame or its technological equivalents. The head examiner, a Corvathian named Zixthor who had 3 advanced degrees in applied cruelty, had proposed this restriction specifically to neutralize what he called the primitive species advantage. Apparently, he had grown tired of watching less technologically advanced participants simply start fires and coast through survival scenarios while species with actual civilization struggled to recalibrate their gravity flux heating units in the field. The examination committee had approved the rule unanimously, then spent 6 weeks drafting an 87-page legal document defining exactly what qualified as prohibited combustion. They had covered every loophole, every technicality, every possible interpretation. They had consulted with lawyers from species whose entire language consisted of contractual clauses. They had peer-reviewed each other's footnotes. They were, in short, absolutely certain they had created an exam that would finally showcase superior technology and evolutionary advantages over crude fire-making skills. None of them had considered friction. The human who stepped off the transport shuttle onto the staging platform looked distinctly unimpressive by galactic standards. Humans had only achieved faster-than-light travel 60 years prior, making them newcomers to a galactic community that measured history in epochs. This particular specimen stood roughly 1.8 meters tall, possessed the standard human bilateral symmetry, and carried a pack that seemed far too small for the 3-week examination period. The Corvathian processing officer had logged the arrival with barely concealed amusement, noting in the official record that participant 73 appeared woefully underprepared and was given a survival probability of approximately 4%. Participant 73, who had grown up in a place called Montana and whose name was deliberately excluded from official records for reasons of narrative convenience, had spent the previous month reading the examination rules with the kind of attention usually reserved for contracts with entities of questionable moral alignment. The human had noticed the combustion ban immediately and had experienced what other species might interpret as dismay, but what was actually the peculiar human expression that preceded creative problem-solving. While other participants packed advanced survival technology and environmentally controlled suits, this human had filled their pack with sticks, rope made from plant fibers, containers made from hollowed wood, and several curious objects that the customs scanners had flagged as primitive tools. The security officer had asked about these items. The human had smiled in that uniquely human way that somehow managed to be both friendly and slightly threatening, then explained these were traditional camping supplies. The officer, who had never been camping and considered the entire concept barbaric, had approved the items and made a note that participant 73 was either extremely confident or experiencing some form of pre-examination psychological break. The dropships deposited all 100 participants across Thrinix 9's harshest continent at precisely 0600 station time. The planet featured temperatures that swung from 40 degrees at midday to -20 at night, winds that could strip flesh from bone if one possessed the soft varieties of flesh, and precipitation that was technically water but had been mineralized to the point of mild toxicity. The native wildlife consisted primarily of creatures that had evolved to eat rocks and considered anything softer than granite to be a delicacy. The vegetation was mostly moss that grew on the aforementioned rocks and harbored a justified resentment toward anything that tried to harvest it. The other 99 participants immediately began deploying their sophisticated survival equipment. The Exetherian delegation activated their molecular reconfiguration domes that could filter atmosphere and generate nutrition from ambient matter. The Praxian team assembled thermal suits that maintained perfect internal temperature through quantum phase manipulation. The Drenthok, who were essentially intelligent crystals, simply vibrated at frequencies that kept their molecular structures stable despite environmental conditions. Everyone had technology, backup technology, and backup plans for when the backup technology inevitably failed. Participant 73 found a cave, examined it for signs of hostile occupancy, and began gathering sticks. The monitoring station orbiting Threnix 9 hummed with activity as dozens of instructors watched feeds from the micro-cameras that had been deployed across the examination zone. These cameras were smaller than sand grains and completely undetectable, which the Academy considered essential for authentic survival observation and also for capturing footage that would later be sold to various galactic entertainment networks. The instructors had divided their attention among the most promising participants, tracking the Exetherian delegation's dome construction and the Praxian team's systematic shelter establishment. One junior instructor, fulfilling the mandatory requirement to monitor all participants regardless of survival probability, pulled up participant 73's feed out of sheer boredom. For several minutes, the human simply sat inside the cave organizing sticks by size and thickness. The instructor was about to switch to literally any other feed when the human began doing something peculiar. The human had taken 2 pieces of wood, one with a depression carved into its surface, the other shaped into a thin spindle. A third piece of wood had been fashioned into a bow, with cord made from plant fibers connecting the ends. The human wrapped the bowstring around the spindle, placed the spindle's point into the depression of the base wood, and began moving the bow back and forth in rapid soaring motions. The spindle rotated quickly, pressed against the base wood. The instructor stared at the feed with mounting confusion. This appeared to be manual labor of the most inefficient variety. What was the purpose? Was this some human meditation ritual? The instructor had heard humans engaged in bizarre psychological practices to cope with stress. Then smoke began rising from where the spindle met the base wood. The instructor sat up straighter, suddenly interested. Within minutes, the human had created a small pile of ember that glowed with heat. The human carefully transferred this ember to a bundle of dried moss and began blowing on it gently, feeding it tiny twigs until flames appeared. The instructor's translator, which had been idling quietly, suddenly produced a phrase in Corvathian that was anatomically improbable but emotionally accurate. The human had created fire without combustion. Or rather, the human had created combustion through mechanical action that technically didn't violate any part of the 87-page rule document. Friction generated heat. Heat generated sufficient temperature to cause wood particles to achieve combustion temperature. None of the prohibited technologies had been involved. The human had simply rubbed two pieces of wood together really efficiently. Within an hour, participant 73 had a substantial fire burning in the cave, had boiled water to remove the toxic minerals, and was roasting some kind of tuber that the human had identified as edible through a process that apparently involved tasting tiny amounts and waiting to see if death occurred. The human's core body temperature had stabilized at optimal levels. The cave environment had become comfortably warm. The human was, by all measurable standards, thriving. The junior instructor forwarded the feed to the senior examination committee with a message that contained more exclamation points than was professionally appropriate. By the end of day 2, participant 73 had established what could only be described as a comfortable base camp. The friction fire burned continuously, fed by a systematic wood-gathering operation that the human conducted for 2 hours each morning. The human had constructed a frame from green branches and was using it to smoke meat from a creature that had made the fatal error of investigating the cave. Another frame held strips of the toxic moss, which the human was drying in the heat, for reasons the monitoring instructors couldn't fathom, but suspected were ominous. Other participants were struggling. The exotherian domes had successfully filtered the atmosphere, but were consuming power at projected rates that would lead to shutdown before the examination period concluded. The Praxian thermal suits were functioning perfectly, but required the participants to remain relatively stationary to conserve energy. The Drenthok had discovered that the local rock formations contained minerals that interfered with their vibrational frequencies and were attempting to relocate to more hospitable terrain. Participant 73 had moved on to advanced cooking techniques. The human had created what appeared to be a clay oven by the third day, formed from mud and rocks, heated and hardened using the friction fire. Inside this oven, the human was baking something that the monitoring equipment identified as bread, though the existence of bread on a planet where grain had never evolved raised numerous questions. The human had apparently ground seeds from the moss into flour, mixed it with water and some kind of leavening agent the human had cultivated from the environment itself, and was now producing actual baked goods in a survival situation that had been designed to prevent anyone from having hot meals. The examination committee convened an emergency session in the station's conference room, which featured a view of Thrinix 9 that everyone was currently too agitated to appreciate. Zixthor stood at the head of the table, his scales reflecting the harsh overhead lighting in a way that suggested internal turmoil. Around the table sat 24 instructors representing various species, all of whom had read the rule document multiple times and were experiencing the unique frustration of realizing that technical correctness was sometimes worse than being wrong. One instructor, a Velian whose species communicated partially through color changes, had shifted through several shades that translated roughly to profound irritation. The question had been raised whether friction-based fire constituted a violation of the spirit of the rules, even if not the letter, Another instructor pointed out that the rules had been specifically designed to be technically precise to prevent exactly this kind of debate. A third instructor suggested they simply disqualified participant 73 for creative interpretation, which immediately sparked a heated discussion about academic integrity and whether the Academy would lose accreditation if they punished participants for being clever. Zixthor finally declared that unless someone could identify a specific rule violation, participant 73 would continue to be evaluated on the same criteria as everyone else. The human had not used prohibited technology. The human had not employed combustion-based devices. The human had simply used mechanical friction to generate heat, which then caused materials to combust. This was technically allowed. The committee members departed the meeting radiating various species-specific expressions of displeasure. By day 7, the situation had evolved beyond anyone's predictions. Participant 73 had not only maintained the base camp, but had improved it to standards that exceeded several permanent settlements the instructors had visited. The friction fire had been supplemented by additional fires. All started using the bow drill method, creating a complex heating system throughout the cave network. The human had created pottery, actual ceramic vessels, fired in a kiln that had been constructed using the same mud and heating techniques. These vessels contained soups, stews, and something the human called chili that contained 17 different ingredients the human had foraged, tested, and combined into a meal that was making the monitoring instructors hungry despite consuming perfectly adequate nutrition cubes. Other participants had begun experiencing the expected difficulties. 3 Exitherians had withdrawn after their domes failed, requesting emergency extraction and promising to leave scathing reviews on the Academy's public forums. The Praxians had successfully maintained their position but had consumed 70% of their suit power and were facing difficult decisions about the remaining 2 weeks. 2 Drenthok had shattered after attempting to cross a valley with incompatible mineral compositions. The survival rate was tracking below projections, which the Academy considered normal and also excellent content for their promotional materials. Participant 73 had started a garden. The human had identified several plant species with edible components, created a small plot near the cave entrance that received optimal sunlight, and was cultivating crops with the long-term planning that suggested the human had completely forgotten. This was a temporary examination. The human had also created what appeared to be a primitive refrigeration system using the cave's natural temperature gradients and some clever airflow management. Preserved foods hung from the cave ceiling. A water collection and filtration system fed into ceramic vessels. The human had essentially established a functioning homestead on a planet where survival had been considered challenging. The instructors watched with a mixture of academic fascination and personal offense. This wasn't how survival examinations were supposed to proceed. Participants were meant to struggle, to show their species' advantages under pressure, to barely survive through clever use of superior technology or evolutionary benefits. They weren't supposed to start friction fires and open restaurants. By day 14, things had taken a turn that the examination committee could only describe as absurd. Participant 73 had been discovered by several other struggling participants who had detected the smoke from the various fires and investigated. The human displaying the social tendencies that had made humanity simultaneously popular and concerning among galactic species had invited them to share the camp. 3 Yorthians who had been on the verge of requesting extraction were now sleeping in a warm cave and eating hot meals. A Selkian who had lost their thermal regulator was recovering near one of the fires. Even a Praxian had stopped by, exchanged some of their advanced rations for a bowl of the mysterious chili, and departed with what the monitoring equipment registered as contentment. The human had somehow turned a survival examination into a hospitality scenario. Zixthor reviewed the feeds with an expression that his species typically reserved for discovering accounting errors. Participant 73 had not only survived but was assisting other participants in surviving, which wasn't technically against the rules, but felt like it should be. The human's friction fires had become a beacon for struggling participants across the examination zone. The Academy's carefully designed test of individual survival capacity had been transformed into a communal camping experience, centered around one human's ability to make heat through mechanical action, and then use that heat to cook surprisingly good food. The final evaluation occurred on day 21, when extraction shuttles arrived to collect the survivors. 63 participants had withdrawn early, requesting emergency extraction due to equipment failure, environmental stress, or simple unwillingness to continue suffering. Of the remaining 37, 12 had spent at least part of the examination period at participant 73's camp. The human emerged from the cave, looking healthy, well-fed, and carrying samples of pottery that the human wanted to keep as souvenirs. The examination committee scored each participant based on the established criteria, including shelter construction, resource acquisition, physical condition maintenance, and problem-solving capability. Participant 73 received perfect marks in every category. The human had demonstrated superior shelter construction using available materials, had acquired and cultivated extensive resources, had maintained optimal physical condition throughout, and had solved the fundamental challenge of survival without advanced technology through creative application of basic physics. Zixthor signed the official results with the kind of resigned acceptance that came from being technically defeated by someone who had never claimed to be competing. The Academy would need to revise their rules again for next year, probably adding specific prohibitions against friction-based heating methods. They would need to update their legal documentation, consult with new specialists, and spend another 6 weeks crafting regulations that would close this particular loophole. The human graduated with honors, received credentials recognized across 7 galaxies, and returned to Earth with stories about how camping skills had proven surprisingly applicable to alien survival situations. The Academy added a new line to their brochures, warning that participants should prepare for unexpected interpretations of examination rules. The Corvathian instructors added friction-based fire, starting to their curriculum, teaching it with the bitter resentment of educators forced to acknowledge that sometimes primitive methods defeated advanced technology through sheer stubborn practicality. Somewhere in the Montana wilderness, participant 73 was probably starting another friction fire and laughing about galactic species who had forgotten that humans had spent millennia surviving through nothing but cleverness, persistence, and an unwillingness to accept that anything was truly impossible. The universe was vast and full of advanced civilizations with remarkable technology, but sometimes the most sophisticated survival tool was knowing how to rub 2 sticks together really, really well.